Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you can join me today for this second part of a series that I've entitled Unhealthy Sex Within Marriage. And I shared last week that I have 8 principles that I'm working my way through in this particular episode. And last week we covered the first 4 principles, which were this. Number 1, God invented sex. Number 2, God has an opinion about sex. Number 3, God's opinion about sex is illustrated all over the Bible. And number 4, God's will, plan, and design is that human sexuality be expressed and experienced exclusively within the context of marriage. And I also shared that the first 4 principles, which I covered last week, were kind of basic principles about sex in general. And the 4 principles that I hope to cover now this week are going to focus in more on this concept of unhealthy sex within marriage. And the idea that we're pursuing here, you guys, is essentially that of course we see that God's will, plan, and design is that sex occur within the context of the marriage relationship, but that does not mean that all the sex that happens within marriage is necessarily healthy sex, and that sometimes the way that we're expressing and experiencing ourselves sexually, even in the context of our marriage, can be profoundly unhealthy and inconsistent with God's will, plan, and design for human sexuality. So that's what we're going to try to talk about a little bit more in this episode. What does it look like for sex to be unhealthy in the context even of marriage? And so our 5th principle, where we continue today, is this. Although sex within marriage is blessed by God, not all sex within marriage is healthy sex. Let me say that again. Principle 5. Although sex within marriage is blessed by God, not all sex within marriage is healthy sex. And in the way of example, in order to try to establish this point, I actually have 8 different examples that I thought of pretty quickly that I'm going to review and share with you guys. 8 different ways that couples can have unhealthy sex, even though they're married. And by the way, this is a list of just 8 different ways that I thought of pretty quickly, although I'm pretty sure that the list could be much longer than these 8 that I'm going to share with you. But I do think these 8 serve as pretty good examples to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here, that all the sex that happens within marriage is not always necessarily healthy sex. And my first example is this: a situation where sex, for whatever reason, virtually never happens or happens very infrequently, such as when a man tells me that the last time he and his wife had sex was 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, or even a year ago, or 6 months ago. And all I can tell you guys is that in my humble opinion, something is terribly wrong in a situation like this, and everything is not okay. And in my estimation, this couple is having very unhealthy sex. There's something about their sexual relationship within the context of their marriage that's profoundly unhealthy, because the fact is, they're essentially not having sex at all. And I do not believe that this is consistent in any way with God's will, design, or plan for their lives and marriage. So the first way that sex can be unhealthy in marriage is when there's no sex at all, or said sex is very infrequently to non-existent. My second example is this: a situation where one person becomes the gatekeeper of sex in the relationship, and sex can therefore only happen when and if they say that it can happen. And by the way, as we've previously identified, it's typically the lower sexed person in the relationship that ends up becoming the gatekeeper of sex, and essentially by default, they assume control of the sexual relationship because basically sex only happens when and if they say that it's going to happen, because the higher sexed partner is willing to have more sex and basically will take sex whenever they can get it. So almost by default, it's the lower sex person who becomes the gatekeeper. But all that I'm suggesting here, again, is that in my opinion, this is not consistent with God's will and plan and design for sex within marriage. I defer to the 1 Corinthians chapter 7 passage, verses 1 through 5, where it quite clearly indicates that the husband should make himself available to his wife, and the wife should make herself available to her husband, and that they should be available to one another, and they should not withhold from one another unless it be by mutual consent, and then only for a very short matter of time, so that they don't experience undue temptation from the devil. So to me, the Corinthians passage quite clearly indicates that both people should have a voice in the sexual relationship in their marriage, and that it's unhealthy for one person to become the gatekeeper. So that's our second example of what unhealthy sex can look like in the context of a marriage. Example number 3 is this: a situation where one or both persons are using sex to control, manipulate, or punish one another. And I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that basically everybody would pretty much agree with that it's wrong for one person to use sex as a weapon or as a tool or as a leverage in any way to control, manipulate, or punish the other partner in the marriage. And if this is how sex is being used, I'd advocate that there's something very unhealthy about the way sex is happening in this particular relationship. And that brings me to my fourth example, which is this: a situation where a person, for whatever reason, doesn't want to have sex with their spouse and does so only out of a sense of duty or obligation or guilt. And I would advocate that this is a total bummer when this happens, and it's very inconsistent with the way that God wants sex to be happening in the context of a marriage between a man and his wife. And that God's intention is that both people would be willing participants and joyful participants, and that both people would want to participate in this activity with one another, and that it isn't reduced to one person doing it just out of a sense of duty or obligation or guilt. And if that's the motive behind it, that there's something very unhealthy about that. Our fifth example of unhealthy sex within marriage would be this: a situation where a person struggles with a deep sense of shame around sex, even sex with their own spouse. And by the way, I'd suggest that when such guilt or shame does exist around a person and their sexual experience, that more often than not, it has to do with unresolved issues from this person's past, maybe sexual history, something very bad that happened to them, experiences they've had, or trauma that they've suffered, and therefore they have a distorted view or understanding or relationship with their own sexual gift, and maybe this has followed them into their marriage, and therefore they struggle with the ability to enjoy sex or to be relaxed or to be sexual, even with their own spouse, and they feel shame around sex, even with their own spouse. And again, I'd suggest that there's something very unhealthy about this, and that this is inconsistent with what God has intended for us to experience as a married couple. And my sixth example of unhealthy sex is a situation or a dynamic that I've seen really repeated over and over again as a pastor and specifically in my role as a Christian counselor. And this occurs typically when the husband has committed adultery, and it might be what I just would call by default the rabbit syndrome. And what happens is, in these situations, the husband is caught acting out sexually in the context of the marriage some way, typically adultery, and therefore, in response, the wife begins to have sex with her husband like a rabbit. In other words, over and over again, every day, constantly, more sex than they've ever had, all the sex the husband wants. The wife begins to have all this sexual activity with her husband. And therefore, in the days and weeks and months that follow, this couple ends up having more sex than they've ever had in the history of their marriage. And typically, the husband responds with an attitude that, in my estimation, is pretty misguided, because he's thinking, man, this is great. I should have got caught years ago, because then I could have been getting all this sex from my wife. Who would have thought that my wife catching me having adultery is the thing that was finally going to turn her on and make her want to have sex with me? So the husband's happy, and he's rejoicing that he's finally getting all this sex from his wife. But of course, I'd advocate that even though this couple's having sex, and that said sex is occurring within the context of their marriage, that this sex, in fact, is very unhealthy and dysfunctional sex. Because the fact is that more often than not, the wife in this situation typically is not having this sex with her husband as the natural response of their loving, safe, and committed relationship, but instead is being motivated by forces such as doubt and insecurity and fear. And basically, the wife might be thinking something like, if I don't give him all the sex he wants, then he's going to go out and commit adultery again. So I better have sex with him every day to make sure that this never happens again. And so let me ask you guys a question. Do you think that this kind of sex is healthy sex? Even though it's sex that's happening within the context of their marriage, I'd suggest that it's very unhealthy sex, that there's something very unhealthy about it, and that in fact this couple has a whole lot of work to do for them to move toward the possibility of having truly genuine healthy sex in their marriage relationship. And that brings me to the seventh example of unhealthy sex within marriage, and it concerns the example of a man who's watching internet porn all the time, and typically his involvement with pornography is motivated by his own sexual addiction. So he watches all this porn, and he gets all lathered up with this intense lust, and then he turns toward his poor wife, and he makes her the target of his lust, and he then unleashes and perpetrates his lust upon his wife. So again, even though this sex is happening within the context of their marriage, I'd suggest that it's not happening in the context of a healthy, loving, committed, caring, safe, and respectful marriage relationship. So again, I'd ask you guys, do you think that this is healthy sex? Even though it's happening in the marriage, I'd advocate that there's something very unhealthy about this. And that brings me to the eighth and final example of unhealthy sex, and that would be where one person or the other, I'd suggest that typically it's the husband, when he places a demand upon his spouse for what could be a wide variety of various fantasies or perversions, possibly a parade of almost endless situations that he's placing as a demand upon his spouse, such as the man who wants his wife to join a swingers club with him, or the man who desires to dress up like a woman to have sex with his wife because he's into lesbian porn, so he wants to pretend like they're two lesbians having sex together, or the man who wants to watch his wife having sex with other men, or the man who wants to do sexual things in violation of his wife's conscience or personhood. And I'm pretty sure this list could go on. And by the way, every example that I just gave you there, the man who wants his wife to be a swinger, the man who wants his wife to dress up like a woman, the man who wants to watch his wife having sex with other men, the man who wants his wife to do many other things in violation of her own conscience. These things are not made up. Every single one of them are situations that I'm aware of and that I've personally been involved in my counseling practice in the effort to help couples have a healthier marriage and a healthier sexual experience in their marriage. So, in conclusion of these 8 examples that I just gave, I think you can quite clearly see that there's a whole lot of different ways that a married couple can be having sex, and just because the sex is happening within the context of their marriage does not necessarily mean that the sex is either healthy sex or functional sex. And in the way of one more example, I'd just like to go ahead and share a story with you from my own life that I'm quite ashamed of and regret that this ever happened. And the fact is, I think I shared this story at some point earlier in the podcast, but I think it's a very appropriate example here, so I'm going to go ahead and share it. And the fact is, it actually occurred right before Sherry and I got married. We had purchased this little house that we were in the process of fixing up, and we had become sexual before we got married. And Sherry had kind of a growing problem with the fact that we were having sex before we got married. Her conscience was kind of wounded about that, and I would say rightfully so. And so one night we were at this house working, and I initiated sex with her, as I did frequently. And I think this was about 3 months before we got married. And she quite clearly indicated to me that she did not want to have sex that night. And she said something like, "I think this is wrong. God doesn't want us to do this. God wants us to wait till we get married." And of course, I wanted to have sex. And so I basically lobbied and I went about the business of selling her. And so I negotiated and I basically said to her, well, what if we did this? What if we just go ahead and have sex tonight, and I promise you it'll be the last time, and we won't have sex again until we get married. And so she reluctantly agreed, and we had sex that night. And then I kept my word, and we did not have sex again. I think it was for about 3 months until we got married. And when I look back at that story, I just deeply, deeply regret that story. And I think it's just absolutely horrible. And even though the sex happened in the context of our relationship, first of all, it was wrong because we weren't even married yet. But I'd suggest that an example like this, even if we were married, the fact is I was coercing her into having this sexual experience with me, when in reality, in her heart, she did not want to participate. She had a weak conscience about it, and I kind of coerced her into it. So I would advocate there was something profoundly unhealthy and inappropriate about this sexual experience. And I think in a terrible way, it was like this concept of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is this concept that I really don't understand, but it's something like when a baby is conceived and it grows within its mother's womb, the 9 months of the development of the fetus are like a microcosm of the entire concept of evolution, the evolutionary process. And what I'm trying to say is I think that story that night was like foreboding, like it contained the DNA of what was going to become the disaster of our marriage, and specifically the issue of sex in our marriage, and that it was already foreshadowing something that was very, very wrong with us. This thing about me wanting sex and coercing it upon my wife and her resisting it and having a weak conscience and us missing each other and being very unhealthy together and dysfunctional together. And I just think that that story was like a foreshadow of the disaster of our impending marriage. And as I've said before, I think the story indicates that I was willing to sacrifice my beautiful wife's conscience on the altar of my own orgasm. And I say that very much to my own shame and regret. And I think it's one of the deepest ways and most profound ways that I've ever hurt my wife. And just something that I really regret, and I wish it would have never happened. And I wish I would have known then what I know now, so that I could have been a completely different man for her. And I could have been a better man and a healthier man, and a man that knew how to respect her and love her and adore her. So again, I just share that story because I think in a way it's just an illustration of this principle that I'm trying to talk about here, that just because sex happens in a relationship, even if it's in the context of marriage, it doesn't mean that that sex is necessarily healthy sex. And in view of that, you guys, I might just ask a question here. And the question might be something like this. If you had to evaluate the sex that happens in the context of your marriage between you and your wife, do you feel like the sex that happens is healthy sex? Or is there something unhealthy about it? Is there work that you and your wife have to do? And I came to the place where I realized that, holy cow, there is something way, way, way wrong with the way that sex is happening in the context of my marriage. And we've got a lot of work to do. And a big, big part of that wrongness concerns who I am as a man, and my understanding of sex, my understanding of women, and the way that I viewed women and objectified women, and all these things that I just didn't understand about myself that really were rooted all the way into my childhood, the concept that fruit comes from roots. And at this point, I didn't even understand my own story. I didn't understand how growing up in the family of origin that I did affected me, how the discovery of all my father's pornography affected me, how the example of the senior male role models in my life affected me, and how being sexually abused by two older females during my adolescence affected me, and how all these things accrued together in combination with just the natural wood grain of my own broken, wounded heart apart from God, which was a wood grain of lust and just sexual brokenness. And something was very, very wrong with me when it came to the topic of sex. And the fact is that wrongness followed me into my marriage because I was just a very broken man. And the fact is my wife was a very broken woman. And when people get married, they don't just marry each other, they marry each other's stories. And therefore, I think it's very, very common, a very common theme, that broken people end up married. People with broken issues around their sexual selves end up married. And therefore, even though they're trying to function sexually in their marriage, the fact is that the way the sex is happening in the context of their relationship and the context of their marriage is very, very unhealthy, even though they're married. And even though God invented sex and God invented marriage and God intends sex to happen in marriage, and God blesses sex in marriage, it doesn't automatically mean that the sex that's happening in every marriage is automatically healthy sex or functional sex. And more often than not, it reveals the brokenness that lives in our hearts and our lives and the issues that we have to deal with. If we're going to move from the unhealthy place we are in our marriage to the healthy place where God wants to bring us as He brings about His redemption and healing and His light and His truth and salvation in our hearts and our lives and our marriages and even within our sexual selves. So I'd advocate that sometimes not only is the sex that's happening in our marriage very unhealthy, but in fact, it's revealing to us the work that we have to do if we're going to get healthier together in our relationship, in our marriage, and in our sexual relationship together. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that I'm actually out of time, and believe it or not, I fully intended to finish this series in just 2 episodes, but for some reason, I was only able to cover point number 5 in this particular episode, so I guess that means we'll come back next week where we will continue with this series entitled Unhealthy Sex Within Marriage. We've got 3 more principles to go, and we've now covered the first 5 principles, which are this. Number 1, God invented sex. Number 2, God has an opinion about sex. Number 3, God's opinion about sex is illustrated all over the Bible. Number 4, God's will, plan, and design is that human sexuality be expressed and experienced exclusively within the context of marriage. And number 5, although sex within marriage is blessed by God, not all sex within marriage is healthy sex. And with that being said, you guys, if you're interested in principles 6, 7, and 8, please come back next week where we'll continue, and I'll look forward to seeing you then right here at the Power of Purity podcast. In the meantime, have an awesome week, have an awesome day, be blessed by God, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. God bless you.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.